She was a sexy young woman with a weakness for men in uniform.
She flirted with the guys. She gets you going.
She was one of those individuals that seems to like police officers.
She even married one.
He rolled in that one evening and he said, "We're gonna get married." I said, "You lost your damn mind."
And 2 years later, she met another.
She told all of us that she was divorced.
It wasn't entirely true. Was it just a little white lie?
Oh, come on, nobody's that stupid.
Or did it mask a deadly secret?
His death was either a suicide or a homicide.
At around 10 a.m. on the morning of January 22, 2001, a couple of Forsyth County, Georgia firefighters arrived at the apartment of Randy Thompson. It wasn't exactly an emergency call.
Several of his friends called and he didn't answer the phone, and they went over there to see why Randy wasn't answering his cell phone or his home phone.
A fellow firefighter and former sheriff's deputy, Randy had spent the past few days battling what he thought was either food poisoning or a serious stomach virus.
He was vomiting a lot, actually dry heaving because I'm sure there was nothing there, but very, very sick.
He'd even been to the emergency room a few days earlier.
All the signs pointed to a stomach virus or to food poisoning.
Back home, Randy had spent much of the weekend in bed, tended by his girlfriend, Lynn Turner.
Sunday afternoon, Lynn said she went by and carried him some food, some chicken soup.
And the following morning, his friends from the fire department had come by to check on him.
He actually had a doctor's appointment that a friend of his was going to take him to.
But there was no answer at the door.
Nobody can get in. He's not answering the phone.
Randy was home, however. Looking in the window, the firefighters could see their friend sprawled out on the sofa. But he didn't appear to be napping.
Randy didn't respond at all to knocks, yells.
My husband was a volunteer firefighter, so I turned on his pager, and I could hear the two-way talk on the radio. So I knew that they were there. I knew something at that point was really wrong.
Worried for his friend, one of the firefighters quickly kicked in the door. But it was too late.
Randy was already dead.
Randy's family and friends were devastated.
He and I were very, very close. He was my firstborn and my only son.
Lynn, however, appeared to be stoic about Randy's death.
She did not act like she was grieving, but Lynn was a very strong person. She was, she stuffed a lot of things. So, you know, that was how I took it. She was just stuffing that morning.
Was the tragedy truly a surprise?
Randy had attempted suicide. He had done it before.
Or was it a deadly case of deja vu? A curvy brunette in a brand new Camaro. People were quick to notice when 27-year-old Lynn Turner returned home to Cumming, Georgia in 1994.
Lynn was very flashy. She always had a flashy car. She always had plenty of money.
She always had plenty of men clamoring for her attention, too.
She flirted with the guys. She gets you going.
Although in 1994, Lynn had her sights set on one guy in particular, Randy Thompson.
Randy and Lynn met each other here in the county through a mutual acquaintance, someone that Lynn had gone to high school with and someone who actually worked with Randy and was friends with Randy.
I couldn't understand why she was chasing Randy like she was. I mean, at first, you know, he just was not interested. She was very, very persistent.
Part of the attraction may have had something to do with Randy's career.
Randy initially worked in the sheriff's department. He left there and became a fireman.
She was one of those individuals that seems to like police officers and law enforcement, and she hung around with them a lot.
Since leaving home at 21, Lynn had not only worked as a 911 dispatcher in neighboring Cobb County, she had even married a member of the force.
It was typical of a lot of marriages. Basically, the marriage just grew apart. They went their separate directions.
She told all of us, including Randy, that she was divorced.
When she first met Randy, Lynn was still living in Cobb County. But once they started dating, she was incoming at every opportunity.
She started coming down here during the week, every weekend, spending an awful lot of time down here.
She also did her best to win over Randy's family. Christmas 1994, she showered the family with gifts.
She bought my husband and I a real nice stereo and CD thing combined, you know. Bought our two daughters nice gifts from Victoria's Secret. You know, I mean, we had just met the girl. And here she was buying all this extravagant stuff.
3 months later, Lynn was back home for good.
She and Randy moved into an apartment here in Cumming.
It was only temporary. That summer, Lynn discovered she was pregnant. She began preparing for the new addition by buying a house.
It was a ranch. It was all one level, a big open area, which was like dining room, living room, kitchen.
And the house was only one of Lynn's many purchases.
She furnished the house, and she had helped Randy buy a new car, and she was just having everything new all the time. And I finally asked her, how can you afford this? And she said that it was her inheritance from her grandmother.
Lynn gave birth to a baby girl in January of 1996.
She was a very loving mother. She was a very good mother.
But just as Lynn appeared to be settling down, her relationship with Randy became increasingly unstable.
Their relationship would be good, but as time passed and as they stayed together, it was volatile.
Tumultuous would be a good way to describe it.
And after the baby was born, their problems seemed to intensify.
They couldn't get along. They just couldn't get along. I mean, they were always jealous of each other. She was very possessive of Randy.
Randy moved out several times.
And the drama didn't stop there.
There had been a couple of half-hearted suicide attempts that Randy had made.
The first time, it was Lynn who dialed 911 and reported that Randy had tried to overdose on painkillers.
Paramedics responded and decided that Randy posed no threat to himself or anybody else and just left him at home.
2 years later, Randy had picked up the phone himself and summoned a friend who took him to the ER.
It was really just an attempt for attention.
Whatever Randy's motivation, the suicide attempts led to a reconciliation with Lynn.
They always did a lot better when he needed her, when he was sick or when he needed something. I think she got self-worth from people needing her.
In 1998, the couple had a second child. But by April of 1999, Randy had moved out again. And this time, he said it was for good.
Randy finally decided that he couldn't take it anymore.
They had just had it. They were like oil and water.
Randy wasn't entirely out of Lynn's life, however. The couple did have 2 children together.
Once they split up and Randy moved out, they still stayed in contact with each other. There was definitely a connection there.
But there was plenty of animosity, too.
Randy would call to make arrangements to see the children, and if Randy did the least little thing to make her mad, she wouldn't let him see them.
In October of 2000, minor sinus surgery produced some major side effects on Randy's health.
He had had a lot of problems. He had a staph infection. He had had a stent put in, close to his heart to give him intravenous antibiotics.
By the following January, Randy appeared on the road to a full recovery.
He was supposed to have that stent out because he was better.
There were signs his relationship with Lynn might improve, too. In the middle of the month, Lynn called and suggested the family get together for dinner at a local steakhouse.
Friday night, Randy had had dinner with Lynn and their children.
Randy was still hoping, because of the children, he wanted to work things out with her and make the children a home.
Afterwards, they went back to Lynn's for dessert. But Randy didn't stay the night.
I had called him that night to see how things had gone, and he said, not well.
And unfortunately for Randy Thompson, things wouldn't get any better. January 21st, 2001. It was a little before lunchtime when Randy received a call from his friend Melanie Harper.
I called him to ask him if he wanted to go to eat with us. He had been sick all day, he'd been vomiting, asked me if we would come over.
Concerned about their friend, Melanie and her husband rushed right over.
When I got there, he was just kind of in another world. He couldn't focus, just kind of in and out, kind of with us and then not with us.
Was it yet another suicide attempt?
He over-medicated himself a great deal. As a matter of fact, they gathered up all the pills in the house and flushed them because they were afraid that he had overdosed and that he would lose his job.
Randy's friends rushed him to the emergency room.
And they pretty much told me that he had a stomach virus.
They gave him some fluids and some other treatment, and he got to feeling better, and they sent him home.
Lynn dropped by several times to help care for Randy as he recovered from his sudden ailment.
She had come over on a couple of occasions.
She went over to his apartment and took him some tea, and also she had taken him something to eat.
On Monday morning, January 22nd, some of Randy's friends dropped back by the apartment to check on him. But Randy didn't answer the first knock or the second.
They're at his apartment. Nobody can get in. He's not answering the phone.
Randy wouldn't come to the door, but his truck was there. And they got permission to break the door and go in.
And when his friends kicked in the door, they found Randy dead on the sofa.
He was lying on his back, stretched out. You know, it appeared that if you just glanced at him that he might be asleep.
Coming up, did Randy die from natural causes?
He had been feeling so sick.
Or had he finally followed through and left Lynn forever?
She said Randy had committed suicide.
On January 22nd, 2001, friends found Lynn Turner's boyfriend, Randy Thompson, lying dead on his sofa. He was only 32 years old.
He was young, and he had just been to see his physician on Friday.
He had been feeling so sick for several days. He's throwing up, he's violently ill, and they take him to the hospital.
During the visit, the doctors had diagnosed a stomach virus or possibly food poisoning. Neither was typically fatal. Could there have been complications? Randy had recently suffered from a fairly serious staph infection.
There was some thought that perhaps his death was related to that infection.
Maybe the antibiotic was too strong for his system, because I think they have to treat that pretty aggressive.
But during Randy's autopsy, the state medical examiner made a startling discovery. It looked as if a foreign substance had overwhelmed Randy's system. But it wasn't an antibiotic.
I looked at all the slides on Randy Thompson, and I saw that there were crystals in his kidneys that looked like ethylene glycol crystals.
Ethylene glycol is a chemical that cannot be produced naturally in the body. The only way that ethylene glycol could end up in a person's body would be for it to be ingested.
Primarily found in antifreeze, ethylene glycol is readily available. And in the right doses, it can be deadly.
The textbook answer for how much ethylene glycol it takes to result in someone's death is that as little as 100 cc's. So we're talking about a third of a soda can.
But why would someone drink antifreeze?
The vast majority of ethylene glycol deaths that we see in our office are suicides.
Randy did have a history of suicide attempts. Had he finally succeeded? Or was there another explanation? What if Randy didn't know he was drinking antifreeze?
Ethylene glycol is odorless and tasteless, except for a slightly sweet taste. So if I take regular antifreeze, and especially some that may be clear, and put it in any food, you're not going to know it's there.
His death was either going to be a suicide or a homicide.
That was assuming the crystals Dr. Capone saw were ethylene glycol. To be sure, he sent tissue samples from Randy's kidneys and urine to the state crime lab for further analysis.
We could not definitively say it was there because the response that was produced on analysis was not large enough.
In the light of a negative ethylene glycol test, I had to come up with another reason why he had these crystals in his kidneys.
As a result, the official cause of death ruled out both suicide and homicide.
I went with the anatomic diagnosis that I had, which was that he had a slightly enlarged heart.
A state crime lab did not think that there was any issue as to the death. Basically, it chalked it up to cardiac dysrhythmia.
But was the case closed? Not as far as Randy's mom was concerned.
I knew something was wrong. I didn't think it was a natural death.
At first, Nita's conviction that her son had died due to foul play was merely a hunch. But then she received a note that changed everything. The note came from a woman named Catherine Turner. Her son was Glenn Turner, the man Lynn said she had divorced.
There was a bereavement card from Kathy, and I read it, and she had her phone number, and she had some of the things that had happened to Glenn in there.
I just was telling her who I was and why I was writing about my son.
One of the first things she told Nita was that her son Glenn wasn't Lynn's ex-husband. He was her late husband.
I found out at that time that Lynn and Glenn were still married when she was seeing Randy.
Lynn and Glenn had met in 1992. At the time, Lynn was a Cobb County 911 dispatcher, and Glenn was a county police officer.
It started out as, let's just put it this way, it'd be pleasant, a one-night stand.
That may have been how it started, but Glenn soon fell for Lynn. He proposed a year later.
He rolled in that one evening and he said, we're gonna get married. I said, you lost your damn mind.
The couple married on August 21st, 1993. Unfortunately, as with Randy years later, constant bickering marred the relationship. The arguments were mostly about money.
Lynn unfortunately had what my parents used to refer to as champagne taste on a beer budget.
Glenn worked more than one job. Lynn worked more than one job.
Lynn was also gone a lot, and she began making frequent trips back to her hometown 30 miles away in Cumming, Georgia.
She would go down on the weekend telling Glenn that she was working undercover for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations.
But back in Cobb County, rumors started circulating that Lynn's work in Cumming was more under the covers than undercover.
I had heard suspicions that she was having an affair, but I didn't have any hard facts, just suspicion.
He had to know deep down in she was doing something, because you got your new bride and you stopped having sex after about probably 60 days, 90 days into the marriage. She said she had a female problem. Oh, come on, nobody's that stupid.
But when Glenn suddenly fell ill on March 2nd, 1995, Lynn was there to take him to the emergency room.
Doctor said, I think you got a virus. You know, something like that. You know, 24, 48 hours, you know, you'll be all right. Send him home.
The next morning, it appeared that Glenn was feeling better. Lynn made him a light lunch before going out to run errands.
He got up and drank some stuff, ate some stuff, some Jell-O.
When Lynn returned, she had found Glenn sprawled out on the bed, not breathing. Minutes later, Glenn's colleagues received an alert no cop wants to hear.
My pager went off, and it had 63 on there, and 63 meant signal 63, officer down.
Glenn Turner was dead, and according to the autopsy, it was due to natural causes.
The medical examiner told me that, you know, he'd had an enlarged heart. That'll happen to him because they're physical and they do a lot of, you know, workouts and stuff, and then all of a sudden they quit.
It was the same diagnosis Randy's mother received. And much like Nita Thompson, Catherine Turner had a hard time believing her son had died from natural causes.
He was a strapping, healthy young man, 31 years of age. To die that quickly and under flu-like symptoms and not ever being sick until he got sick this time, something was wrong.
But even as Catherine Turner struggled to deal with her son's death, her daughter-in-law, Lynn, was moving on.
Days after Glenn Turner's death, she moved in with Randy Thompson.
6 years later, Randy would be dead, and Catherine Turner would be on the phone with his mother.
Kathy and I started comparing notes about Glenn's death and Randy's death, and everything was so much the same. The illness, the way they were sick.
It was amazing. She wouldn't hardly give me a chance to talk. I mean, she was telling me all the things that she was telling me was just exactly what I had gone through.
The next day, Randy's mother contacted Dr. Kaponen at the state medical examiner's office.
That's when I first learned about Lynn Turner and the death of her first husband.
The medical examiner found out that Lynn had been married and that her husband had passed away rather unexpectedly.
Was it merely a coincidence?
I had a very strange feeling when they left my office because all this other information was very concerning to me. And so at that point, I went and talked to the toxicologist and see what they could do about re-examining their data.
And when the toxicologist recrunched his numbers from Randy's toxicology analysis, he realized he'd made a critical mistake.
In fact, what I thought was an insignificant quantity of ethylene glycol was actually 10 times larger.
The medical examiner ruled Randy Thompson's death to be a homicide by ethylene glycol.
Forsyth County authorities immediately opened a murder investigation, and Lynn Turner was at the top of their suspect list.
She was the person who had been with him shortly before he became ill, so she had the opportunity.
And if Randy had been murdered, what about Glenn Turner?
I got a copy of Glenn's autopsy report, and I reviewed the microscope slides. And it's when I reviewed those slides that I saw the oxalate crystals.
When he saw the slides of the kidney, found out the calcium oxalate crystals, notified the medical examiner here, and then the body was exhumed.
While forensic specialists collected samples from Glenn's body, Cobb County reopened the investigation into his death. And it wasn't long before Lynn was at the top of their suspect list, too.
Lynn was the common denominator between Randy and Glenn.
There was also the affair with Randy Thompson that started well before Glenn's death. But would it be enough to convince a jury to convict her of murder?
There was nothing at the scene to indicate foul play, and the medical examiner couldn't or didn't find anything in the autopsy. There was really no investigation into his death as being a homicide until after Randy Thompson's death.
Flipping through photos taken at the time of Glenn's death, investigators stumbled across an intriguing possibility. Did a snapshot from the Turner's garage contain a potentially crucial clue overlooked 6 years earlier?
Can of antifreeze shows up, but I didn't think nothing about it. I mean, it was a garage, and you know, you're going to have things like that in your garage.
Unfortunately for Lynn, her garage wasn't the only place investigators found antifreeze.
The medical examiner here, after he has exhumed the body, found the ethylene glycol, issued another death certificate which shows that the death is homicide.
I slammed my hand down on the desk, and I knew it.
By the end of October, as Forsyth County authorities continued to build their case against Lynn and Randy's death, Cobb County investigators were ready to act. On November 1st, 2002, the Cobb County District Attorney's Office charged Lynn Turner with the first-degree murder of her husband, Glenn.
Lynn was indicted on one count of murder, and she ultimately turned herself in to the Cobb County Sheriff's Office.
Coming up, Prosecutors struggled to put the poison in Lynn's hands.
This was a circumstantial case entirely.
And Lynn prepares to face a jury of her peers.
Lynn, people are calling you a murderer. Is that true?
April 26, 2004. 3 years after Randy Thompson had been found dead on his sofa, his girlfriend Lynn Turner went on trial for murder. But while she was a suspect in Randy's death, it wasn't his murder she was on trial for. Instead, she was charged with the 1995 death of her husband, Glenn Turner.
Both men had died the same way, by ethylene glycol poisoning.
Cause of death wasn't the only thing the two men had in common, however.
The primary connection between those two is Lynn. I think that was the biggest problem that we had to overcome in the case.
And under Georgia law, Randy's death would be a crucial factor in the current trial.
The law here in Georgia allows you to put in evidence of what we call similar transaction.
We have the ability to introduce evidence that somebody else has been involved in the same activity for which she's on trial for.
And in Lynn's case, the judge agreed to allow Randy Thompson's death to be introduced as evidence, even though she had yet to be formally charged in his murder.
We felt, obviously, that should not be done, but the court allowed that in.
And when the prosecution delivered its open that morning, the DA was quick to capitalize on the opportunity.
The evidence will show that there is one link, there is one thread, there is one common denominator, and it's this woman, Julia Lynn Womack Turner.
According to the prosecutors, Lynn had murdered her husband partly to facilitate her affair with Randy. But it wasn't her only motive. There was also money. The fortune Lynn had spent buying and furnishing her new home incoming.
From my understanding, the reason she had money was because her grandmother had died previously and she had inherited a good amount of money from that.
That's what Lynn had told Randy and his family, at least. But it wasn't entirely true, prosecutors claimed. Lynn had inherited some money from her grandmother, but the big windfall had been Glenn's death.
Lynn actually benefited in a couple of ways when Glenn died. There was the death benefits that the county has, which was several $1,000s.
There was also a $100,000 life insurance policy that listed Lynn as the beneficiary.
She had Glenn change the beneficiary on his policy, life insurance policy, before they actually got married, while they were still engaged.
In addition to Glenn's death benefits and insurance, Lynn also cashed in on her late husband's pension.
Because they had been married long enough, she would draw his pension. So she was drawing $600 and something a month from his pension in addition to the life insurance benefits.
Her motivation was money all the way around. I don't think you can get anybody that'll say anything differently.
The state then told the jury that Lynn had killed her husband by spiking Jell-O, soup, and sweet tea with ethylene glycol-rich antifreeze.
Ethylene glycol is reported as having a sweet taste to it. And so ethylene glycol can be hidden in a number of foods or drinks that have a sweet taste.
Next, toxicologists testified that evidence of ethylene glycol poisoning was found in both Glenn's and Randy's kidneys.
Byproducts of ethylene glycol are oxalate crystals, and these oxalate crystals deposit in the tubules in your kidneys and result in renal failure, which is not a pleasant way to die.
The state then called a witness from a local animal shelter who testified that Lynn had inquired about the effects of ingesting antifreeze.
Lynn had called up there asking about poisons and stuff, about as far as what it would take to kill a human being compared to a dog, how much it would take.
But were all her questions hypothetical?
She also inquired how the veterinarians there would put animals down. And they told her that they didn't know the name of it, but what the vets used was purple stuff.
She had asked me, could anybody get it? Was it easy to get a hold of? And I told her no, it was a controlled substance.
It was a revelation that caught many in the courtroom off guard.
I mean, when I heard that, I thought, I mean, there's any doubt now, I mean, that's pretty much the nail in the coffin. I mean, I thought that was critical.
One person in the courtroom who wasn't noticeably moved by the state's case, though, was Lynn herself.
You mean you would be hard to notice that she was the one that was on trial for murder? Giggling, laughing, cutting up, walking around the court area. I mean, just, she didn't look real stressed out or concerned. Just very cool, calm, and in control.
Why was Lynn so unconcerned about the charges against her? According to her attorney, part of it was simply her personality.
She doesn't show emotion very well. That's the way she is. She internalizes everything.
But as her defense team pointed out in their opening arguments, Lynn also had reason to be confident. The prosecution's case had one large problem. There was no physical evidence that could prove Lynn had introduced the antifreeze into Glenn's system.
Who introduced it, if it was introduced? The state cannot show that in this case.
I think most prosecutors would like to have as much tangible evidence as you can have. In this particular case, we didn't really have that much.
In fact, Lynn's counsel argued that the presence of oxalate crystals in Glenn's kidneys didn't necessarily mean he was poisoned at all.
Some crystals are formed naturally. There is ethylene glycol in some embalming fluid. The funeral home, when we were dealing with the investigation of the case, could not find the records of what embalming fluid was used.
He also attacked the methodology that was used in testing the bodily organs to determine whether or not there was any ethylene glycol present in Glenn Turner's internal organs.
But in their closing arguments to the jury, the prosecution countered the defense's claim by reminding jurors that Randy's kidneys had also contained evidence of ethylene glycol.
It would be highly unlikely that two people would die of exactly the same poisoning and have a relationship with one woman.
But highly unlikely didn't necessarily mean beyond a reasonable doubt. Would the jury believe the state's circumstantial case was enough to convict?
This was a circumstantial case entirely, and that is sometimes a little more difficult to convince a jury just based on these circumstances.
When the case went to the jury, Glenn's mother was confident her son would finally get some justice.
There was nothing I was concerned about as far as the trial went. I felt like everybody did a fantastic job.
Lynn appeared just as confident of an acquittal.
And some of the news reporters, you know, they were out to dinner and Lynn walked up to the table to him in the restaurant. They were drinking a beer. She said, "Oh, I'll have one of those tomorrow night." And they said, "Oh, you will?" She said, "Oh, yeah. All this junk will be over with. I'll have one of those tomorrow night."
Coming up, tension mounts as the jury returns its verdict.
You've got 12 people who have got to view all of the evidence the same way that you have viewed it.
On May 14, 2004, Lynn Turner walked into the courthouse alongside her attorneys for the close of her murder trial. Charged with poisoning her husband with antifreeze, the 35-year-old faced life in prison if convicted. After receiving instructions from the judge, the jury broke for deliberations. While confident in their case, without a so-called smoking gun, the prosecution knew that anything could happen.
I was as concerned when it went to the jury about what they were going to do as I was when we started. You've got 12 people who have got to view all of the evidence the same way that you have viewed it.
5 hours later, the jury announced it had reached a verdict.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Julia Lynn Womack Turner, guilty of malice murder as alleged in count 1 of the indictment.
Indebtedness, the lifestyle, all of those things that when you put all the pieces together, they basically took the place of the smoking gun.
Lynn was sentenced to life with the possibility of parole in 14 years. If she was fazed by the verdict, she didn't show it.
Just calmly reached up with that old look she has of that, you know, I'm better than you, and taking her earrings off like it was no big deal.
How could someone sit there and listen to these things and have no reaction, either anger or sadness?
Apparently because it hadn't yet dawned on Lynn just what life in prison meant.
When we learned from the deputy that was taking her across, she said, my attorneys will be over here in a minute. How long do you think it'll take them to set bail for me? She said, ma'am, do what? She said, how long do you think, I'm hungry. How long do you think it's going to take my attorneys to get over here and get my bail set? She said, ma'am, you just got convicted of malice murder. You're not going anywhere.
Actually, she would be going somewhere, to a Georgia prison to serve a life sentence for murder. But she was back in court in October of 2004. There, 5 months after being convicted of killing Glenn Turner, she was formally charged with the murder of Randy Thompson.
Charging you with murder, having committed the crime of murder. How do you plead? Guilty or not guilty?
We plead not guilty, Your Honor.
Forsyth County authorities saw things differently, of course. According to the indictment, Lynn had followed up Glenn's murder by poisoning Randy almost 6 years later. And once again, the alleged motive was insurance money.
With Randy, she stood on one policy to get $200,000.
Lynn's motivation was money and greed. That's all she thought about, was money and what she could get with the money.
Lynn's second trial began on March 12, 2007, and this time the stakes were much higher.
The prosecution had filed its intention to seek the death penalty, so the jury is the one who determines punishment in that circumstance. They had the choice of life with a possibility of parole, life without parole, or death.
But while the stakes had certainly risen, the prosecution's open would have sounded awfully familiar to anyone who had followed Lynn's first trial. The state's evidence, witnesses, and case against Lynn remained largely the same.
Anytime that the prosecution has what's called a similar transaction, where you had this first case that was so much like our case, and then that there had been the conviction, that always helps.
When Lynn's attorney presented his open, he added a new wrinkle to the proceedings. In marked contrast to Glenn's trial, the defense didn't deny that Randy had died of ethylene glycol poisoning, but that didn't mean he had been murdered.
We felt that Randy may have ingested the ethylene glycol himself.
Her defense team wanted people to think that Randy had committed suicide.
As proof, they pointed to Randy's history of suicide attempts.
Randy had a problem with taking prescription pills. He over-medicated himself a great deal. One specifically where he had overdosed, had to go to the hospital.
And why would Randy commit suicide on this particular occasion? According to the defense, the Friday night fight with Lynn was only one factor.
His financial condition was very poor. He was behind in pretty much everything. They were getting ready to take his truck. Just a lot of things, I think, in Randy's life that weren't going well.
Would any of Randy's friends confirm the assertion? Although called by the prosecution, Melanie Harper came close when questioned by the defense. On the stand, she admitted that Randy's friends hadn't ruled out the possibility of a suicide attempt.
We believed that he was probably toxic. He had taken too much medication.
Would the suicide angle be enough to raise reasonable doubt and allow Lynn to escape a death sentence? In closing arguments, the prosecutors did their best to defuse it.
The only rumors that have been introduced in this case were those that the defense asked about in their questioning of the witnesses.
Instead, the prosecution asked that the jurors focus on the facts and the unlikely set of coincidences that connected Randy and Glenn.
There were so many similar circumstances that was amazingly alike. I mean, freakishly alike.
But according to the prosecutors, the ultimate thing Glenn and Randy had in common was the woman who killed them.
To her, They represented things like down payments on boats, cars, and finally just a way to keep her lights and cell phone on. They were worth so much more to her dead than they ever were alive.
When it was the defense's turn, Lynn's attorneys argued there was a good reason the prosecution's case dwelled on coincidence. It was all they had.
The evidence isn't there. They can't tell you when this happened, where it happened, how it happened, because there's no evidence. And they can surmise, or they can predict, or they can assume, but that ain't the law.
On March 24, 2007, Lynn Turner was seated at a defendant's table for the second time. The 38-year-old widow was awaiting the verdict in her second capital murder trial. She faced the possibility of death if convicted. In the crowded courtroom, the jury foreperson read the verdict aloud.
We, the jury, find the defendant guilty this the 24th day of March, 2007.
Lynn, of course, did not react to the verdict. She has not reacted really to any of the verdicts, but that's her personality.
Besides, jurors weren't done with Lynn just yet. 3 days after the verdict, they reconvened to decide her ultimate fate.
You have here a unique ability. You can save a life, or you can take a life.
The jury had the choice of life with a possibility of parole, life without parole, or death. And in Forsyth County, she received a sentence of life without parole.
I was disappointed. These were cold-blooded killings that required thought, premeditation, some planning, and they were solely for money. I thought she deserved to die.
For Glenn and Randy's loved ones, though, the fact that Lynn will never be able to hurt another cop's family is justice enough.
I just wanted her to be put where she could not hurt anybody else and not put another family through what she had put the Turners and us through.
She's a very cruel woman, and she's getting her punishment. And I just leave her be.
She was a sexy young woman with a weakness for men in uniform.
She flirted with the guys. She gets you going.
She was one of those individuals that seems to like police officers.
She even married one.
He rolled in that one evening and he said, "We're gonna get married." I said, "You lost your damn mind."
And 2 years later, she met another.
She told all of us that she was divorced.
It wasn't entirely true. Was it just a little white lie?
Oh, come on. Nobody's that stupid.
Or did it mask a deadly secret?
His death was either a suicide or a homicide.
At around 10 a.m. on the morning of January 22, 2001, a couple of Forsyth County, Georgia firefighters arrived at the apartment of Randy Thompson. It wasn't exactly an emergency call.
Several of his friends called and he didn't answer the phone, and they went over there to see why Randy wasn't answering his cell phone or his home phone.
A fellow firefighter and former sheriff's deputy, Randy had spent the past few days battling what he thought was either food poisoning or a serious stomach virus.
He was vomiting a lot, actually dry heaving because I'm sure there was nothing there, but very, very sick.
He'd even been to the emergency room a few days earlier.
All the signs pointed to a stomach virus or to food poisoning.
Back home, Randy had spent much of the weekend in bed, tended by his girlfriend, Lynn Turner.
Sunday afternoon, Lynn said she went by and carried him some food, some chicken soup.
And the following morning, his friends from the fire department had come by to check on him.
He actually had a doctor's appointment that a friend of his was going to take him to.
But there was no answer at the door.
Nobody can get in. He's not answering the phone.
Randy was home, however. Looking in the window, the firefighters could see their friend sprawled out on the sofa. But he didn't appear to be napping.
Randy didn't respond at all to knocks, yells.
My husband was a volunteer firefighter, so I turned on his pager, and I could hear the two-way talk on the radio. So I knew that they were there. I knew something at that point was really wrong.
Worried for his friend, one of the firefighters quickly kicked in the door. But it was too late.
Randy was already dead.
Randy's family and friends were devastated.
He and I were very, very close. He was my firstborn and my only son.
Lynn, however, appeared to be stoic about Randy's death.
She did not act like she was grieving, but Lynn was a very strong person. She was, she stuffed a lot of things. So, you know, that was how I took it. She was just stuffing that morning.
Was the tragedy truly a surprise?
Randy had attempted suicide. He had done it before.
Or was it a deadly case of déjà vu? A curvy brunette in a brand new Camaro. People were quick to notice when 27-year-old Lynn Turner returned home to Cumming, Georgia in 1994.
Lynn was very flashy. She always had a flashy car. She always had plenty of money.
She always had plenty of men clamoring for her attention, too.
She flirted with the guys. She gets you going.
Although in 1994, Lynn had her sights set on one guy in particular, Randy Thompson.
Randy and Lynn met each other here in the county through a mutual acquaintance, someone that Lynn had gone to high school with and someone who actually worked with Randy and was friends with Randy.
I couldn't understand why she was chasing Randy like she was. I mean, at first, you know, he just was not interested. She was very, very persistent.
Part of the attraction may have had something to do with Randy's career.
Randy initially worked in the sheriff's department. He left there and became a fireman.
She was one of those individuals that seems to like police officers and law enforcement, and she hung around with them a lot.
Since leaving home at 21, Lynn had not only worked as a 911 dispatcher in neighboring Cobb County, she had even married a member of the force.
It was typical of a lot of marriages. Basically, the marriage just grew apart. They went their separate directions.
She told all of us, including Randy, that she was divorced.
When she first met Randy, Lynn was still living in Cobb County. But once they started dating, she was in Cumming at every opportunity.
She started coming down here during the week, every weekend, spending an awful lot of time down here.
She also did her best to win over Randy's family. Christmas 1994, she showered the family with gifts.
She bought my husband and I a real nice stereo and CD thing combined, you know. Bought our two daughters nice gifts from Victoria's Secret. You know, I mean, we had just met the girl, and here she was buying all this extravagant stuff.
3 months later, Lynn was back home for good.
She and Randy moved into an apartment here in Cumming.
It was only temporary. That summer, Lynn discovered she was pregnant. She began preparing for the new addition by buying a house.
It was a ranch. It was all one level.